Now, recently I caught up with a farmer neighbour of a small property that I have on the Monaro, and I hadn't seen him for some time. And the first thing he said to me was, we've had some nice rain, but not enough. And the second thing he said to me was, well, cattle prices are pretty high and I've really got to be buying. No surprises, farmers, what's the topic? Climate, the weather, or commodity prices. One or the other, and one follows the other one. So with climate, it's either too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold, and certainly in more recent years, it's been very much, when's the drought going to break? It's really only this last 12 months that we've had some reasonable rain. Already people are forgetting what we went through prior to that. I know we had the Prime Minister at Mulloon Creek probably a few months before the drought sort of started to break, and I was able to say, we've had the driest 7 months, continuous 7 months on record since records started in the last 1800s. But we've still got ground cover, we've still got water flowing down the creek. So, where'd that come from? You tell me, he said. Well, I said, because we banked it. When we did get rain, it's still been working, it's been holding in that landscape, it's been doing its job. This is what being resilient is all about from a farming point of view. We had the bizarre situation in Queensland where they'd had years of drought and then had this unbelievable flood. Thousands and thousands of head of stock were killed in that process, and within a couple of months they were back in drought. How does that work? In relation to commodity prices, the National Farmers Federation have a target agricultural output of $100 billion by 2030. It's always good to have targets, I guess. More important about how you get there. It's currently stuck at about $60 billion and has been for a number of years. So we won't get to $100 billion unless a couple of things happen, and that means either an increase in production or an increase in prices to push that dollar value up. And in my view, neither of those will occur unless agriculture changes. So those two farmer topics, climate and prices, are very closely linked. And the work that the Mulloon Institute is doing is fundamental to solving those two problems. So let's start with water. Fresh water, only about 2.5% of the world's fresh water, which is rain, whereas the rest of it is not fresh. In Australia, on the driest continent in the country, 50% of that 2.5% is lost through either evaporation or runoff. There's far too much bare agricultural land that accelerates that runoff and evaporation, resulting in erosion and a loss of soil. Our waterways have basically become drains, and when you do get some rain, the rain's in the creek and gone before it can be properly utilised. And combined with those sort of circumstances, the water cycle, which is so important to the whole agricultural operation, is broken. And with the vegetation lost, have been probably one of the greatest contributors to a warming planet. So if we could reverse those consequences tomorrow, we'd keep more rain on the farm, we'd minimise evaporation, we would retain soil, and slow down waterway flows and rehydrate the adjoining landscape, fix the water cycle, and therefore cool the planet. First problem solved. If we put in place good regenerative practices such as rotational grazing, legume pasture cropping, no-till, organic composting, cover cropping, crop rotation, we will improve soil health, produce higher nutrient-dense food, which is good for humans, and would increase productivity. Second problem solved. But there are three other massive benefits of doing those things. In carrying out the repair and rehydration and changing farming practices, farmers will be dragging CO2 emissions out of the atmosphere and putting it back in the soil where it belongs as soil organic carbon. Soil carbon, in fact, is the single biggest terrestrial carbon pool on Earth. It's estimated to contain something like 2,300 gigatonne of carbon down to a depth of 3 metres. The atmosphere only contains 820 gigatonne and above ground biomass 610. Total emissions from fossil fuel burning and cement manufacture is about 9 gigatonnes in 2019. So it's actually possible to absorb the world's annual anthropogenic emissions in soils. So farmers have a golden opportunity to be a major player in solving our emissions and climate problem. Improving soil health with an increase in soil organic carbon is a huge benefit to farm production and health of the food that they produce. But it also gives farmers an opportunity to be involved in carbon and biodiversity credit trading. Rule changes are required at the federal level, and as I understand, we are getting traction to make those changes so that the incentives for farmers to be involved will increase from what they are at the moment. That plus the technological developments that are happening with measurement of carbon particularly will see farmers benefit from huge dollars that will be available from carbon trading and another income to the farm. The second benefit from this work is increased resilience to drought, flood and bushfire. Keeping more water in the landscape keeps ground cover longer, helps farmers cope with those inevitable dry periods that will keep coming. We won't stop them, but we can make people so much more resilient to it. Taking the energy out of the water and spreading it mitigates against damaging floods. And during the 2019-20 bushfires, we were able to demonstrate how hydrated or rehydrated landscapes slowed the path of damaging bushfires and in fact in some cases actually stopped those bushfires. The other benefit is substantial increases in biodiversity, remembering that about 90% of biodiversity is actually soil, and Carolyn will talk a bit more about that shortly. So achieving the reversals I've spoken about starts with restoring the natural landscape functions. This is what we do at the Mulloon Institute, a not-for-profit charity on the federal government's environment register with DGR status. We work at the catchment scale, repairing and rehydrating it. We share our regenerative land practices, monitor the outcome and educate farmers and land managers on these practices. We have our own commercial farm, which was bequeathed to us by our founder, Tony Coote, when he passed away, left the farm so that we can continue our research work in perpetuity. We've got about 2,500 hectares, which acts as a demonstrator and produces probably the best eggs you can buy in Sydney, Harris Farm Stores, Mulloon Creek Natural Farms, get in the thing, and part of the Pavlova today. And we've been recognised internationally by the United Nations Sustainable Development Network as one of only 5 projects to help guide sustainable, profitable and productive agriculture. So I'm going to hand over to Carolyn, who will take you through the work we've done, are doing and plan to do. But before that, I'm just going to run a quick 2-minute video which will give you a little bit more information on the Mulloon Institute. We're not only showing that you can repair and rehydrate landscapes, but you can do it so that agriculture can not only be sustainable, it can actually be more productive. The value of this work will really be realised when you do whole catchments.
The natural systems in Australia are hitting the wall. The new regenerative agriculture movement, which we're talking about here at Mulloon Creek, the huge importance of changing our natural systems to hold water in the landscape, which drives health and regeneration. And without that, we're going to continue destroying both our Australian landscape function and the earth systems.
I mean, nearly every farmer wants to leave their land in a better state. We were just taught the wrong techniques in the past. What I keep learning from Mulloon, from the scientists, is ways of working with nature.
A lot of people think it's either the environment or the economy. It is absolutely possible to have really good environmental performance and really good economic performance.
I've been involved with the Mulloon Institute for the last 15 years. We must urgently rehydrate landscapes. We must rebuild the hydrological cycle for our own water security, food security, stable biosystems, but most importantly, a stable climate.
There's 1 million kilometres of incised valley floor in Australia. If you multiply that water banking capacity across the whole of Australia, and all of a sudden you're holding on to an almost incalculable amount of water, we're regenerating the environment, we're regenerating a whole watershed. This ancient landscape has all the answers that we need for us to go forward. And it's important to the social well-being of communities and of the nation.
I really want to talk to you today a little bit about what the Mulloon Institute actually does. We're all about practice and on-ground works. I'm going to run you through some before and after photos at Mulloon. These photos really do speak 1,000 words, and I think once you've seen the photos and listened about the information that I can provide about what we do, I'm hoping that your eyes will be opened and you'll be forever changed. The Mulloon Institute really is Australia's premier scientific organisation for landscape rehydration and repair. We're focused, as Gary said, on fixing a broken water cycle. We're all about actively promoting holistic management and regenerative agriculture. And our objective, as Gary said, is to create a resilient, sustainable and profitable landscape for everybody in the future. Our expertise really lies in surface and groundwater management. We're concerned with recognising the hydrological processes that operated in the Australian landscape and bringing them back to life so that rainfall can be kept on land where it falls. Our work extends from the very top of the hill right down to the streams and rivers. At Mulloon, when we think about the changes that are required to adapt to a changing climate and meet our targets around commodity prices, we know that business as usual is not going to take us to the NFF's $100 billion target for Australian agriculture. We need a new paradigm led by agriculture and the environment working together, responding to real-world problems that farmers are facing. And we want to create a resilient landscape and resilient communities in doing so. At Mulloon, it's all about practice leading the way. It's practical on-ground works that are demonstrating what we can do. Okay. And we've got a project at Mulloon, the Mulloon Rehydration Initiative, that demonstrates this. It's an example of restoration and rehydration at the catchment or watershed scale, and we see this project as a model that can be scaled up and applied across Australia and, where appropriately, internationally. The project is also a great way to reach out to everybody. Everybody that comes and sees the project gets excited. It can, however, be an opportunity to see where regulatory frameworks and also policy can get in the way of this good work. And in that way, we've got to give a shout out to our Mulloon Law Committee. We've got a founding member, Wilfred Finn, in the audience today, and our chair, Matt Edgerton-Warburton. We're indebted and we're grateful. We also have to give a shout out to Ministers Pavey and Minister Stokes, our water and planning ministers in New South Wales. They've engaged with us and their teams are helping us to move toward the regulatory reform that we need to mainstream landscape rehydration across the state. So what does innovative practice look like at the catchment scale? The MRI covers over 23,000 hectares and 50 kilometres of creek. We've got 20 landholders involved. That makes it a very social project. The MRI also supports a range of monitoring sites, and some of those you can see in the map here. There's a lot of high-tech equipment distributed throughout the catchment that's going to provide a lot of information as the project moves forward. At its core, the MRI is a research project. It's concerned with natural capital, with financial capital, and with social capital returns. Monitoring is driven by an overarching monitoring plan that integrates everything that goes on. Now I want to run you through those photos I talked about, and hopefully you'll be impressed. The MRI does, among a range of other things, create leaky weirs in the creek. These are soft engineered natural eco-structures that trigger landscape regeneration and become part of the stream system. They're designed to raise the water level, to rehydrate the floodplain and rebuild aquatic and riparian habitat. We're essentially rebuilding wetlands in the system, and these wetlands create habitat not just for native species but also species that are endangered across Australia. The leaky weirs slow water, encouraging sediment to deposit, building the bed of the stream, making it easier for regular flows to overtop the creeks, the creek banks, and recharge local aquifers. We're rebuilding those big, spongy, wet floodplains that can support any sort of agricultural enterprise. Historically, those same big, spongy, wet floodplains that were come across by our first explorers were also major carbon sinks. Changes in land use, including clearing and the introduction of our grazing animals, have eroded those creeks and, as Gary said, lowering the bed and making them drains to the ocean, taking the water table down with it and taking water away, drying out those floodplains. Their disturbance and their degradation has reduced their fertility and productivity and severely limited their ability to sequester carbon. Our repair and rehydration of floodplains can create the conditions where once again those systems can be productive, they can provide habitat, and they can sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Repair, in fact, triggers a full cycle of improvement. Improved water retention on the floodplain, improved soil carbon levels, improves vegetation, and increases the productivity of farming land. And water is released slowly over time, building resilience to drought, to bushfire and to flood. We're banking water in the soil and releasing it very slowly. The following slides show the construction of a rock and log leaky weir. But you can see that once they're established, it's actually vegetation that settles them into the landscape and does the hard work. And this is the same weir about 12 months after construction. It's measures just like these that helped with water quality post the 2019-2020 fires in the Bungendore area. Upstream, the Talaganda State Forest was also almost completely burned, and there was a flush in August of 2020 of a whole lot of material that we don't want in our water supply. The leaky weirs and repair work that we've done in Mulloon Creek stopped that material, deposited on the lower Mulloon floodplain, and kept it out of Tallowa Dam. We're not just working in New South Wales on the southern tablelands, we're working elsewhere as well. Up in Queensland, we're working in the Burdekin and Triple B catchments with North Queensland Dry Tropics and the Commonwealth Government. Our work up there is all about meeting sediment saving targets for the reef. We're increasing productivity by extending the growing season just slightly either side, but at the same time we're rebuilding biodiversity. Our approach in Queensland is very popular with landholders because we're reaching those productivity targets, but we're also saving sediment. I don't want to give you the impression that all we do is on the creek. This is an example of work we do at the top of the system, a contour that slows water down and holds it in the landscape at the top of the hill. The vegetation planted on the lower side brings fertility, and with gravity that can be taken slowly down the slope and into the system. The findings of the MRI have been incredibly positive. Monitoring has demonstrated that improved and sustained water flow and quality that comes from water banked in the floodplain. That's important at Mulloon because we're part of Sydney's drinking water catchment. Gains have also been realised in farm productivity and biodiversity. And these are the points where it gets pretty exciting. In the pilot project that was constructed in 2006, the introduced gambusia or mosquito fish is pretty much absent from that part of the system. That's pretty exciting for us because it enables rebuilding for a whole lot of layers of ecology that otherwise would have been stopped in their tracks by the mosquito fish. The habitat at Mulloon Creek has also been assessed by the scientists at Taronga Zoo as the most suitable for release of the yellow spotted bell frog. This is a species that's extinct in the wild and only kept alive in a captive breeding population at Taronga Zoo. And we've had rolling releases, trial releases of that species since spring 2019. Our work in the Molonglo catchment is all about reintroducing the hydrological regime to look after the green and golden bell frog. That species is endangered at the national level, and the population on the Molonglo is the last known population on the southern tablelands. So with the MRI, we've got an outstanding example that brings agriculture and environment together, and it's based on research and it's in response to real issues faced by real farmers. Through the MRI, we see that demonstration is the key to driving the practice change that we need, but also in achieving the policy change and in sharing knowledge with politicians and a whole range of stakeholders. Farmers, academics, students, business people, everybody that comes to Mulloon is really interested and wants to share what they've learned. And we believe that landscape scale repair and rehydration, when combined with regenerative agriculture, is the key to that new paradigm that Gary was talking about. The MRI has put practice first. It's driven by a real world problem faced by farmers, a broken water cycle, eroded creeks, less productive floodplains and less productive land. It's shown that a relatively simple solution to a very complex problem can increase productivity, can have environmental co-benefits and reflect good science. It can also take care of farmers and increase their happiness and social well-being. But that's not enough. We've got to reach politicians and policymakers. Our chairman, Gary Nairn, AO, has been incredible in that regard. I don't think there's anyone that he hasn't spoken to. The bushfires, the flood and the recent pandemic have really helped focus Canberra's attention on solutions to these sorts of problems. Sometimes I think our proximity to Canberra helps quite a lot. As Gary mentioned, our advocacy work has seen the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Agricultural Minister visit Mulloon. They had nothing but praise for our work. More recently, we've had the Honourable Shane Stone, Coordinator General of the Drought and Flood Recovery Agency visit, and we've also had His Excellency David Hurley, the Governor General. We're actually seeing a paradigm shift toward regenerative agriculture, and issues like soil organic carbon and the hope it holds to address climate change may be one of these key drivers. We know that fixing our broken water cycles and rebuilding our soils can create the conditions to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, and when we combine it with regenerative agriculture, there is real potential for our soils to become a carbon sink. The numbers Gary described earlier are really making that plain. As mentioned on our video, our Australian landscape has all the answers that we need. But we need politicians and policymakers to understand this potential and take on these solutions and forge and fund effective policy. Philanthropy made the MRI possible. It's provided an opportunity to showcase a remarkable project, an innovative approach that can have major national benefits. Advocacy work has been key in this, and just maybe our timing is good. But we want to take this approach national so that all landholders across Australia can see the benefit that this approach offers. We want to continue driving the regulatory reforms that our Law Committee has championed, and we want to see good policy linked to funding mechanisms like the Futures Drought Fund and the Emissions Reduction Fund. The MRI really is a case study of the new paradigm that we need to cool the planet, with agriculture and the environment working together. We want to thank you all for listening to us today, and hope that we've given you some hope for the future.